On a quiet August morning in suburban Colorado, a man stood in his driveway and spoke softly into a local news camera. He looked exhausted, worried, almost gentle. He asked for his wife and daughters to come home. He thanked neighbors. He wiped his eyes. To millions watching later, he looked like a husband caught in every family's worst nightmare. That man was Chris Watts. From the outside, his life appeared carefully assembled. A steady job in the energy sector. A newly built house on a calm street. 2 young daughters whose photos filled social media feeds. A pregnant wife who documented family routines, milestones, and optimism about the future. Friends described him as quiet, agreeable, dependable. The kind of man who avoided conflict and kept his head down. When his wife and daughters failed to answer calls that morning, concern escalated quickly. A friend alerted police. Officers entered the home and found something unsettling in its normality. Shoes by the door. A handbag left behind. Medication untouched. Beds neatly made. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no chaos that matched the idea of a sudden disappearance. Chris returned home while officers were still there. He cooperated immediately. He walked them through the house. He spoke calmly. He agreed to interviews. To neighbors, he said he hoped they had simply gone to a friend's place. On camera, he repeated one phrase again and again. He just wanted them back, but investigators were already noticing fractures in the story. Digital records showed movement that didn't align with his timeline. His demeanor shifted depending on the audience. In private conversations, he offered explanations that didn't quite match earlier statements. Surveillance footage from a nearby home showed his truck behaving differently that morning than on any normal workday. Behind the scenes, detectives began reconstructing the hours before the disappearance, minute by minute. They learned of growing tension inside the marriage, financial strain, arguments about trust, and a secret relationship Chris had been hiding, one that pointed toward a life he wanted and a family he appeared to see as an obstacle. The pressure tightened. Investigators arranged a polygraph examination, a common tool used not as evidence, but as leverage. Before the test even concluded, the story cracked. What began as denial shifted into partial admission, then into something darker. Chris stopped speaking as the worried husband searching for answers and began speaking as a man trying to manage consequences. By the end of that day, the image presented on the driveway, the calm protector asking for help, no longer held. Investigators now understood that the disappearance was not a mystery unfolding outward, but a decision made inward, long before the cameras arrived. And as the truth started to surface, one realization settled heavily over the case. The danger had never come from outside the home. It had been standing in the driveway the entire time. Once the first version of the story collapsed, investigators moved quickly. What followed was not a dramatic chase or a sudden revelation, but something colder. A methodical closing of doors around a man who had already run out of exits. In a recorded interview room, Chris Watts was confronted with contradictions he could no longer explain away. Digital location data placed him exactly where he claimed he had not been. Phone records revealed silence where there should have been panic. Surveillance footage showed preparation, not confusion. Each detail tightened the frame until denial became impossible to sustain. When he finally admitted responsibility, it was not framed as rage or chaos. It was framed as control. He spoke in measured sentences, attempting to manage how the story would be understood. He minimized. He redirected. He tried, even then, to protect an image not of his family, but of himself. That effort failed. Investigators recovered evidence that contradicted every attempt at softening the truth. The timeline showed planning. The actions showed intent. The aftermath showed calculation. Prosecutors would later say this was not a moment that went wrong, but a decision that unfolded step by step. The legal process moved faster than many expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Watts entered a guilty plea rather than proceed to trial. In open court, the full scope of the crimes was laid out without theatrical language, just facts, timelines, and irreversible outcomes. The plea removed any possibility of parole and spared surviving relatives a prolonged public trial. At sentencing, the courtroom shifted from investigation to reckoning. Family members spoke directly to the man who had once promised to protect them. Their statements were restrained, precise, and devastating. There were no threats, no raised voices, only clarity. They spoke of trust violated, futures erased, and the weight of betrayal that does not fade with time. The judge's words were equally direct. Multiple life sentences were imposed, to be served consecutively, with no opportunity for release. The ruling emphasized not only the loss of life, but the abuse of trust at the center of the case. The fact that the harm came from someone whose role was care, not danger. In the months that followed, the case became a reference point across the country. Not because it was legally complex, but because it was psychologically unsettling. There was no criminal history, no outward warning signs dramatic enough to fit old stereotypes. What frightened people was the ordinariness, the idea that the performance of normal life had hidden something so destructive. Criminologists and legal analysts noted the pattern: image management, secret reinvention, and the elimination of perceived obstacles rather than confrontation. It was not impulsive violence. It was erasure. Today, the name Chris Watts is no longer associated with the man who spoke softly to cameras in his driveway. It is associated with a different lesson, one that echoes across many cases like it. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the story is not the one who looks threatening. Sometimes it is the one everyone trusted to keep the door locked from the inside. On the surface, it began as a vigil. When Scott Peterson stood outside his Modesto home in late December, cameras framed him as the worried husband everyone expected to see. He spoke calmly. He thanked volunteers. He asked the public to help find his missing wife. Candlelight gatherings followed. National television carried his face into millions of homes. And for a brief moment, the story fit a familiar script. Devoted spouse, sudden disappearance, community united in hope. But investigators do not work on scripts. They work on timelines. Behind the scenes, detectives began mapping the hours before and after the disappearance. What they found was not a single contradiction, but a series of small shifts, details that changed depending on the audience. A morning errand here, a different destination there. Each revision was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern. The story was adjusting to the evidence, not the other way around. Then came the alibi. Peterson said he had gone fishing alone that morning, an ordinary explanation, until its timing and location were placed under scrutiny. The body of water he named became central to the investigation, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Prosecutors would later argue that the choice of location was not random, and that it aligned too closely with where remains would eventually be found months later. Digital breadcrumbs followed. Phone records showed calls that did not match the emotional urgency expected in a missing person crisis. Purchases suggested preparation rather than panic. Witness sightings placed Peterson in moments he had not initially mentioned. None of it was explosive on its own. That was the prosecution's advantage. This case was built on accumulation. As media coverage intensified, so did scrutiny of Peterson's private life. Investigators uncovered a relationship he had concealed, one that reframed his public statements. In recorded conversations, he spoke about loss before the disappearance had even been publicly acknowledged as fatal. Prosecutors would later argue this revealed not grief, but foresight. The tone of the case shifted. What began as a search became a question of narrative control. Peterson continued to appear composed, almost distant, even as the story darkened. Supporters saw a man overwhelmed by tragedy. Investigators saw emotional inconsistency, not hysteria, but detachment, and began testing whether that detachment aligned with innocence. When remains were discovered months later along the shoreline investigators had been quietly monitoring, the case hardened. The location, condition, and timing all fed into the circumstantial framework prosecutors were constructing. There were no eyewitnesses to violence, no confession, no single piece of evidence that stood alone. Instead, there was convergence. By the time charges were filed, the public narrative had fully reversed. The husband, once framed as a victim, was now the focus. Prosecutors argued that the disappearance was not sudden chaos, but the endpoint of a private decision made long before the cameras arrived. As the trial approached, one question hovered over everything that followed. Was this a tragic coincidence stitched together by suspicion, or a carefully managed story finally collapsing under its own weight? That question would define the courtroom battle, to come and decide whether the image America first saw on television was a grieving husband, or the opening act of something far colder. The trial of Scott Peterson was never about a single, shocking revelation. It was about whether a mosaic of ordinary details could prove something extraordinary. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece. There was no dramatic confession, no eyewitness describing a moment of violence. Instead, the state asked jurors to focus on sequence and intent. They argued that the disappearance was not a mystery unfolding in real time, but a plan already in motion, one that only looked chaotic once it collided with public attention. The defense pushed back hard. Peterson's attorneys framed the case as an example of media distortion and investigative tunnel vision. They argued that once suspicion settled on the husband, every neutral fact was reinterpreted as sinister. Fishing alone became suspicious. Calm behavior became cold. In their telling, prosecutors had taken grief and awkwardness and recast them as evidence of guilt. But the prosecution returned again and again to timing. Jurors heard how Peterson's account of his movements shifted subtly over days and weeks, never dramatically enough to collapse outright, but enough to raise doubt. They heard recordings of phone calls in which he spoke about loss before any official conclusion had been reached. They saw how physical evidence aligned not with chance, but with the exact location he had named early on. The most powerful argument was cumulative. Each inconsistency alone could be explained away. Together, prosecutors said, they told a story of preparation rather than panic. In 2004, the jury agreed. Peterson was convicted of murder. The verdict ended one chapter but opened another because the legal story was far from finished. Years later, appellate courts revisited the case, not to reassess guilt, but to examine how the trial had been conducted. Judges scrutinized jury selection, media exposure, and procedural fairness. The conclusion was nuanced. The conviction itself stood, but the sentencing phase had been compromised by errors. The original death sentence was overturned and replaced with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For supporters, the appeals confirmed their belief that the case had been tainted from the start. For prosecutors, the outcome reinforced their central claim. Even when stripped of its most severe penalty, the verdict held firm because the evidence, taken together, was sufficient. What remained unresolved was the cultural impact. The Peterson case became a reference point for how modern trials unfold under constant media glare. It reshaped how investigators handle missing person cases involving spouses. It also hardened public skepticism toward televised pleas, the realization that emotion on camera can be performance, confusion, or truth, and that distinguishing between them is dangerously difficult. Years after the verdict, Peterson continues to file appeals, maintaining his innocence. Each filing reopens debate, but none has reversed the core finding of guilt. The legal system, for now, considers the case settled. Yet the unease lingers. Because the most unsettling aspect of the Peterson case was never the courtroom drama or the headlines. It was the possibility that a story could look so ordinary at the start, a husband asking for help, a community lighting candles, and only later reveal itself as something else entirely. A reminder that when protectors are placed at the center of tragedy, the hardest question is not what we want to believe, but what the evidence, quietly and patiently, is willing to prove.
An apparent explosion was so powerful it shook neighbors' homes and sent bits of insulation from the house raining down on the neighborhood.
From the outside, the Powell household looked unremarkable. A young family, living an ordinary suburban life across Utah and later Washington. But in 2009, that normalcy fractured in a way that would never be repaired. The disappearance of Susan Powell did not begin with chaos. It began with explanations. Her husband, Josh Powell, told police that she had gone missing overnight after a late trip. He described taking his sons on an impromptu camping excursion in the middle of winter, a detail that struck investigators as unusual but not immediately criminal. There were no witnesses to a struggle, no obvious signs of a violent incident inside the home. Just a woman who vanished, and a husband whose story raised more questions the longer it was examined. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, inconsistencies surfaced. Phone records, digital activity, and neighbor observations suggested a night that did not unfold the way Powell described it. Friends told police that Susan had been fearful in the weeks before her disappearance. She had spoken about controlling behavior, financial pressure, and a growing sense that she was being watched not by strangers, but from within her own home. The investigation quickly narrowed. No body was found, but the absence itself became part of the evidence. Prosecutors later described the case as one where the silence was loud. Susan had left behind her wallet, identification, and personal items she never would have abandoned voluntarily. Everything pointed inward, yet the case stalled. Without physical remains, charges could not be filed. Powell was named a person of interest, but never arrested. The criminal investigation remained open, while a parallel process unfolded in family court. Susan's parents fought for custody of their grandsons, arguing that the unresolved disappearance made Powell unfit. Judges faced an impossible task, balancing legal standards with an undercurrent of fear that could not be fully proven. Over time, more warning signs emerged. Detectives uncovered disturbing material on Powell's computers, including writings that suggested fixation, resentment, and a desire to control narratives rather than lives. Former employers and acquaintances described him as isolated, rigid, and increasingly detached. Still, nothing crossed the threshold required for prosecution. The public watched the case turn cold in real time. Media coverage transformed Susan Powell into a symbol not just of a missing spouse, but of how difficult it is to act decisively when danger hides behind technicalities. Advocates asked why restraining orders, supervised visitation, and custody safeguards were treated as negotiable when the central mystery remained unresolved. By the early 2010s, the question was no longer just what happened to Susan Powell. It was whether the system had enough tools or enough urgency to act when the evidence was circumstantial. But the risk felt real. That question would soon become unbearable, because while investigators searched for answers about a disappearance, events were quietly moving toward an ending that would erase any chance of clarity and force the country to confront how many alarms can sound before someone is finally heard. The case never went to trial. There was no verdict, no confession, no recovery. And then, in 2012, a single afternoon in Washington would close the door on truth forever and expose the cost of every missed warning along the way. By early 2012, the Powell case existed in a legal gray zone, unresolved, unsettling, and heavy with warnings that had never fully translated into action. Susan Powell was still missing. No remains, no charges. Her husband, Josh Powell, continued to deny responsibility while living under the weight of public suspicion. Law enforcement maintained an open investigation, but without the final piece, the case could not move forward in criminal court. Family court, however, was a different battlefield. After years of hearings, judges had imposed supervised visitation between Powell and his sons. The supervision requirement itself was an acknowledgement. While nothing had been legally proven, the risk could not be ignored. Visits were to take place under strict conditions, with third parties present and safety plans in place. But systems depend on people following procedure and on the belief that rules will hold. On a February afternoon in Washington state, a social worker arrived at Powell's rental home to facilitate a supervised visit. The exchange began normally. The sons stepped inside ahead of her. Moments later, the door slammed shut. What followed unfolded rapidly and irreversibly. Emergency responders were called, but by the time help arrived, the house was already beyond saving. The incident claimed the lives of Powell and his sons and destroyed the scene itself, eliminating any remaining chance of discovering what had happened to Susan Powell years earlier. The case was over, not resolved, not answered, just closed by finality. In the aftermath, shock turned into anger. How, people asked, could this have happened under supervision? Why was a visit allowed inside a private residence? Why were prior warning signs, the writings, the behavioral red flags, the unresolved disappearance not enough to trigger stronger safeguards? Multiple reviews followed. Child welfare agencies, courts, and law enforcement all faced scrutiny. Policies were re-examined. Training protocols were revised. Some changes were implemented nationwide, particularly around supervised visitation standards and risk assessment in cases involving unresolved domestic violence or disappearances. But reforms came too late for the Powell family. Susan's parents, left without their daughter or grandchildren, became advocates for systemic change. They spoke publicly about the danger of treating absence of proof as proof of safety, especially when patterns of control and fear are already documented. Criminologists later described the Powell case as a convergence failure, not one mistake, but many small decisions, each defensible on paper, that together created a fatal opening. The disappearance that began in 2009 ended not with answers, but with a permanent silence. No confession, no remains, no courtroom reckoning. Only a file marked closed and a question that still echoes through family courts and investigative units across the country. When warning signs appear again and again, how many times can a system look away before the cost becomes irreversible? In early 2006, Neil Entwistle and his wife arrived in Massachusetts carrying the language of renewal. They had left England for what friends described as a clean slate, a new job, a new country, a young family stepping into a hopeful chapter. To neighbors in the quiet suburb where they settled, they appeared reserved, polite, and unremarkable. Nothing about the move suggested danger. Then, one winter morning, first responders entered the home and found a scene that immediately resisted simple explanation. From the start, investigators said the physical details did not align with an accidental or self-inflicted event. Doors were locked. No signs of forced entry. And yet, the narrative offered in the earliest hours, confusion, shock, a terrible misunderstanding began to fray under scrutiny. As police interviewed Neil Entwistle, they noted inconsistencies. Timelines shifted. Small details changed between statements. His emotional responses struck detectives as oddly detached, not proof on their own, but enough to sharpen attention. Forensic analysis deepened the concern. Examiners concluded the sequence of events inside the home did not support an accident scenario. The positioning of evidence, the absence of indicators consistent with the explanation given, and the overall reconstruction suggested intentional actions rather than a spontaneous tragedy. Entwistle, meanwhile, left the United States and returned to England shortly after the incident. To investigators, the departure raised new questions. Why leave during an active investigation? Why not remain and cooperate fully if the incident was a misunderstanding? Prosecutors would later argue that the move looked less like grief and more like retreat. British authorities detained Entwistle, and after legal proceedings, he was extradited back to Massachusetts to stand trial. By then, the case had transformed from a local investigation into an international legal process, watched closely on both sides of the Atlantic. In court, prosecutors did not rely on a single dramatic revelation. Instead, they assembled a mosaic: forensic findings, digital records, financial stresses, and behavioral patterns after the incident. They argued that while any one piece might seem ambiguous alone, together they formed a consistent picture. The defense countered with an alternate explanation, one rooted in tragedy rather than intent, and questioned the interpretation of forensic evidence. They emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses and argued that assumptions were being layered onto incomplete facts. The jury deliberated carefully. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Neil Entwistle was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court concluded that the evidence supported a deliberate act, not an accident, and that the contradictions were not incidental, they were central. For the public, the case unsettled deeply held assumptions. A move meant to symbolize safety and opportunity had ended in irreversible loss. A quiet household, far from extended family and familiar surroundings, had become a closed system where warning signs were easier to miss. As the courtroom emptied and appeals discussions began, one theme lingered, a recurring pattern seen in cases like this. When a fresh start is framed as escape rather than renewal, what is being left behind and why? The trial was over, but the questions were not. In the final phase, attention would turn to how behavior after the event, not just what happened inside the house, shaped the outcome, and why this case still resonates as a study in how contradictions can speak louder than confessions. By the time the trial of Neil Entwistle reached its final phase, the prosecution's strategy was clear. This was not a case built on spectacle, but on accumulation. No single moment explained everything. Instead, it was the pattern, what did not fit, what shifted, and what followed, that carried the most weight. Prosecutors returned repeatedly to behavior after the incident. They argued that actions taken in the hours and days that followed mattered as much as the physical evidence itself. Investigators testified about missed check-ins, delayed calls, and choices that seemed disconnected from the urgency one would expect after a household emergency. In court, these moments were presented not as emotional judgments, but as factual deviations from expected conduct. Digital records played a supporting role. Computer activity, online searches, and timing logs were used to frame a broader timeline, one that prosecutors said conflicted with the version initially offered. Again, none of this was dramatic on its own, but together, it suggested forethought rather than confusion. The defense worked to dismantle this narrative, piece by piece. Attorneys emphasized that grief can present in unexpected ways, that cultural differences and shock can distort behavior, and that forensic interpretation is not infallible. They argued that the case leaned too heavily on inference on what prosecutors believed someone should have done, rather than what could be proven beyond doubt. But the jury was tasked with weighing consistency. Witnesses from law enforcement and forensic teams explained how the physical scene aligned with a controlled sequence rather than an accident. Expert testimony highlighted why alternative explanations failed to account for key details. And throughout the proceedings, the prosecution returned to a single question. If this was not intentional, why did so many independent facts point in the same direction? When the verdict was delivered, it reflected that convergence. The jury found Entwistle guilty of murder, and the sentence life imprisonment without the possibility of parole closed the legal chapter of the case. Appeals followed, as expected in a conviction of this magnitude, but the outcome remained unchanged. Outside the courtroom, the case settled into public memory as something quieter, yet deeply unsettling. There was no extended chase, no prolonged mystery, no hidden accomplice revealed years later. Instead, it was a reminder of how quickly a private space can become isolated, especially when family lives far from familiar support systems. For many observers, the lasting impact of the Entwistle case lies in its restraint. The story did not hinge on a confession or a single piece of dramatic evidence. It turned on contradictions, on after-the-fact decisions, and on the slow realization that the fresh start narrative had masked deeper fractures. In the end, the court did not rule on emotion, character, or intent in the abstract. It ruled on alignment, whether the story told matched the evidence left behind. And in this case, the jury concluded that it did not. Some cases leave behind unanswered questions. Others leave a different legacy, a cautionary reminder that when actions after a crisis speak louder than words, silence itself can become part of the evidence.
A new hearing is set for Thursday. Police arrested Peterson earlier this month for the 2004 death.
From the outside, Drew Peterson looked untouchable, a veteran police officer from suburban Illinois. He spoke to cameras with ease, joked with reporters, and seemed oddly comfortable narrating his own tragedies. When his third wife was found unresponsive in a bathtub in 2004, the death was initially ruled an accident. Peterson stood beside investigators, publicly grieving, publicly cooperating, and publicly confident that the system he knew so well would move on, and it did. For years, the case stayed quiet. No arrest, no charges, just a file closed with routine language. Friends and colleagues accepted the explanation. After all, accidents happen. Especially, some said, in households under stress. Then came wife number 4. In 2007, Peterson's fourth wife disappeared without warning. There was no confirmed departure plan, no packed luggage, no credible sighting that held up. What there was, prosecutors would later argue, was a familiar script. Shifting explanations, selective memory, and a husband who once again positioned himself as the calm narrator of chaos. Peterson told media she had left him, that she was unstable, that she was living under a new name. He gave interviews instead of retreating from attention, appearing relaxed, even amused, as speculation grew. To many viewers, it was unsettling. To investigators, it was a delay, not a conclusion. As pressure mounted, authorities reopened the earlier case. This time, they looked at it differently. Forensic experts re-examined the death of the third wife with fresh eyes and modern standards. What had once been labeled an accident began to look less certain. Prosecutors focused not on spectacle, but on structure, similarities in relationship dynamics, control issues, and how each situation unfolded once a wife was no longer present to speak for herself. Crucially, the fourth wife's disappearance changed everything, even without a body. Investigators argued that while one incident might be dismissed, 2 followed a pattern. And patterns, they told the court, are not coincidences. They are indicators. Behind the scenes, a legal breakthrough emerged. Illinois law at the time allowed certain out-of-court statements made by unavailable witnesses to be introduced if prosecutors could show a pattern of wrongdoing designed to silence those witnesses. It was a rare strategy, and a risky one, but it opened the door to testimony that would otherwise never be heard. The case moved forward, not as a mystery, but as a reconstruction. Prosecutors did not promise answers to everything. They promised alignment, timelines that made sense, behavior that repeated, explanations that evolved only when challenged. They framed Peterson not as a monster, but as someone who believed control could substitute for truth, and that confidence could outlast scrutiny. As the trial approached, Public perception shifted. The same interviews that once made Peterson seem cooperative now played differently. Jokes landed flat. Smiles felt misplaced. The calm began to look rehearsed. And for the first time, the question was no longer what happened, but how long had it been happening. The courtroom would soon decide one case beyond reasonable doubt, but the other, defined by absence, would force a far harder question. What does justice look like when proof is gone, but the pattern remains? By the time the trial began, the story of Drew Peterson had already lived several lives in the public eye. First, as a tragic accident, then as a suspicious disappearance. Finally, as a prosecution built not on spectacle, but on pattern. The courtroom strategy was deliberate. Prosecutors did not try to solve every unanswered question. Instead, they focused on the one case they believed could be proven beyond reasonable doubt: the reclassified death of Peterson's third wife. They argued that what once looked like a household mishap now fit a broader behavioral arc: control, escalating conflict, and a consistent effort to manage narratives once a spouse could no longer speak. Key to the case was Peterson's own voice. Recorded statements, media interviews, and casual remarks, once dismissed as bravado, were replayed under oath. Jurors heard contradictions stack up, timelines that shifted, explanations that adapted only after new facts emerged, confidence that seemed less like innocence and more like familiarity with process. Prosecutors framed him not as impulsive, but methodical, someone who believed he understood investigations well enough to stay ahead of them. One of the most consequential moments came from testimony about fear. Statements attributed to the third wife, introduced under Illinois' doctrine allowing evidence from unavailable witnesses when wrongdoing is alleged, suggested she believed harm was possible. The defense objected fiercely, but the judge allowed it, ruling that the jury had the right to hear context if it helped explain silence. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Peterson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to decades in prison. The confidence that once fueled his television appearances evaporated in the stillness of the sentencing phase. For the court, one case was now resolved, but the other never was. The fourth wife's disappearance remained exactly that, a disappearance. No confirmed location, no recovered remains, no final charge that could survive the legal threshold required for trial. Investigators maintain their suspicions, but suspicion is not proof. And without proof, there could be no second verdict. This unresolved absence became the enduring shadow of the case. For some families, justice arrives with a sentence. For others, it never fully does. The Peterson story came to represent both outcomes at once. Accountability achieved in one courtroom and permanently deferred in another that could never convene. Public debate followed. Some argued the conviction showed the system working patient, corrective, willing to revisit past conclusions. Others pointed to the unanswered disappearance as evidence of its limits. Even a guilty verdict, they said, does not always equal closure. Peterson himself continued to proclaim innocence from prison, filing appeals and statements that echoed his earlier confidence. Courts reviewed them. None succeeded. The conviction stood, yet the case never truly closed. It became a reference point in legal circles for pattern-based prosecution, in media ethics discussions about how visibility can distort perception, and in public memory as a warning that charm, authority, and familiarity with systems can delay accountability but not always prevent it. In the end, the story leaves a quiet, unsettling truth. Sometimes justice is decisive. Sometimes it is partial, and sometimes it is forever defined by who is no longer there to testify.
911 emergency, what's emergency?
Help me! My God, my wife's breathing!
Okay, you need an ambulance?
I need everything!
The call came in as an emergency, but the tone was calm. In the early hours of a winter morning in Springfield, Illinois, Mark Winger told police he had acted to protect his family. According to his account, an intruder had broken into the home. A violent struggle followed, and Winger had done what any husband would do: stop the threat. At first glance, the scene appeared to support him. A man lay dead in the living room. Winger's wife was also found lifeless. Winger himself was unharmed. He spoke clearly, confidently, and repeatedly framed the event as a single, fast-moving crisis. Officers initially treated him as a survivor of a traumatic home invasion, but investigators are trained to look for friction between stories and spaces. As the house was examined more carefully, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. The position of objects, the sequence implied by marks on walls and floors, the absence of defensive injuries where they might be expected. None of these details proved anything on their own. Together, they raised a question the original story could not comfortably answer. Did the scene reflect panic or planning? Winger's narrative also began to evolve. Early statements emphasized surprise and immediacy. Later versions added clarifications. Timelines tightened. Explanations adjusted to match what investigators were learning, rather than what had been said before. Prosecutors would later argue that these shifts were not memory lapses, but recalibration. The second figure in the room became central to the case. The man, Winger, identified as an intruder, had a known connection to the household. Investigators learned he had previously interacted with Winger's wife. That discovery reframed the entire event. What had been described as random now looked specific. What had been framed as chaos now appeared targeted. As the investigation deepened, authorities began treating the home not as a crime scene interrupted by violence, but as a setting designed to tell a story. Ballistics evidence suggested controlled action rather than defensive reaction. Forensic reconstruction challenged the idea of a sudden struggle. And perhaps most damaging, digital and financial records pointed to tension beneath the surface of what had appeared to be a stable marriage. Still, the case did not move quickly. Years passed. Winger was not arrested immediately. He continued working, raising his daughter, and living in the same community where the event had occurred. To outsiders, the absence of charges looked like exoneration. To investigators, it reflected caution. They wanted a case built to last, not one rushed to court. When charges finally came, they were comprehensive. Prosecutors alleged that the scene had been staged to support a self-defense claim, and that the narrative had been rehearsed in advance. They argued motive not as rage, but as control over outcomes, over perception, and over how events would be interpreted once authorities arrived. The defense pushed back hard. They framed Winger as a grieving husband caught in a system determined to rewrite tragedy as intent. They attacked the delay, questioned witness reliability, and warned jurors against hindsight bias. But the jury was asked to focus on one question only: which version of events required fewer assumptions to be true? When the verdict came, it was decisive. Mark Winger was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The case became a touchstone in criminal law discussions, not because of spectacle, but because of patience. It showed how an initial explanation, even one that sounds plausible, can unravel when measured against physical evidence and time. And it left behind a sobering reminder. Some stories are told once in panic, others are maintained through discipline. But the truth has a way of asserting itself slowly, quietly, and all at once. By the time Mark Winger walked into court, nearly a decade had passed since the night he told police he had acted to protect his family. That delay became the centerpiece of the case. Prosecutors did not rush. They rebuilt the event piece by piece, arguing that the truth of the scene could not be understood in isolation. Only over time, as statements shifted, as relationships came into focus, and as physical evidence was re-examined with distance rather than urgency. At trial, the state reframed the original emergency call not as the beginning of the story, but as its final act. They told jurors that the house had not been frozen in panic, but arranged with intention. The positioning of bodies, the order in which force was applied, the absence of chaos where chaos should have been. According to the prosecution, the scene did exactly what it was meant to do: point away from the person who survived it. The most damaging evidence was not dramatic, it was methodical. Forensic experts testified about trajectories and timing. Investigators explained why certain actions described by Winger would have left marks that were not present. Digital records and communications revealed tension beneath the surface of the marriage. Not explosive conflict, but sustained strain. And then there was the story itself. Jurors heard multiple versions of the same event, delivered over years. Each version fit the evidence available at the time it was told, but not the evidence that emerged later. Prosecutors argued that this was not coincidence. It was adaptation. The defense countered with a familiar refrain: grief distorts memory. Trauma reshapes recall. A man who lost his wife should not be judged for imperfect phrasing or evolving details. They reminded jurors that Winger had never fled, never hidden, never broken under questioning. They emphasized the delay in charges, suggesting that if the case were strong, it would not have taken so long to bring. But the prosecution leaned into that delay. They told jurors that truth does not always surface immediately, especially when it is buried beneath a carefully constructed explanation. They argued that patience was not weakness, but precision. As closing arguments unfolded, the case narrowed to a single issue. Was this a tragedy misread over time or a plan revealed by time? The jury deliberated longer than expected. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The verdict found Mark Winger guilty. The sentence was life imprisonment. There was no outburst, no collapse, just a quiet finality that matched the tone of the case itself. In the years since, the Winger case has been cited not for shock value, but for what it illustrates about modern investigations. That initial appearances can mislead, that early sympathy can cloud scrutiny, and that some of the most consequential crimes are not loud or frantic. They are calm, contained, and explained away until evidence refuses to cooperate. The story that began as self-defense ended as design. And the lesson left behind is an unsettling one. When a narrative survives too perfectly, when it adjusts just enough to remain intact, it may not be the truth holding steady. It may be someone holding it together. On a quiet morning in Westfield, New Jersey, the house looked exactly as it should. Curtains drawn just enough to soften the winter light. Breakfast dishes rinsed and stacked. A note placed carefully on a desk, written in steady handwriting, explaining that the family had gone away for a few days. Inside that stillness, John List carried out what prosecutors would later describe as an act of deliberate erasure. List was not known as volatile. He was a meticulous accountant, a church-going husband, a man who believed order was a moral duty. He worried obsessively about appearances, about finances slipping, about neighbors noticing the decline, about failing in the role he believed defined his worth. In 1971, those worries hardened into a decision. After the house went silent, List did not panic. He did not flee in haste. He changed clothes. He turned on lights. He set a radio to play hymns, as if sound itself could preserve normality. Then he walked out the front door and disappeared. Days turned into weeks. No ransom note, no confirmed sightings. Investigators entered the home and felt the wrongness immediately, not chaos, but control. The note spoke of relocation and spiritual peace, yet nothing in the house supported a hurried departure. Time itself seemed staged. As months passed, the case grew colder. Leads evaporated. List had no criminal record, no history of violence, no obvious escape plan. The trail suggested something rarer and more disturbing. A man who had prepared to stop existing as himself, And that is exactly what he did. Under a new name, List built another life. He moved states. He remarried. He joined a church choir. He became, once again, a quiet man in the background, the kind people described as reliable, even kind. The past did not chase him. It waited. For nearly 18 years, the case sat in filing cabinets and memory. Detectives retired. Evidence yellowed. The house was eventually demolished, its absence becoming part of the legend, a blank space where a family once lived. Then technology caught up. In the late 1980s, investigators turned to forensic artistry and early computer aging techniques. A sculpted bust of what John List might look like decades later was displayed on a national television program dedicated to unresolved cases. Someone watching recognized the face. The tip was simple: a name, a town, a man who looked familiar. When authorities arrived, they found List living exactly as he always had: orderly, reserved, unremarkable. He did not resist. He did not deny who he was. According to those present, he simply nodded, as if the long delay had finally ended. His trial would come later. The explanation would be framed in words like pressure, pride, and belief. But in Part 13, the story is not yet about the courtroom. It is about disappearance as strategy. About a man who believed that if he removed himself cleanly enough, the world would accept the substitution. And about a truth that followed him anyway, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently, until the mask finally matched the memory. When John List was brought back to New Jersey in 1989, the story shifted from mystery to reckoning. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived under another name, held steady jobs, attended church, and remarried. To the people around him, he was dependable, mild, almost invisible. Now, he was standing in a courtroom where time had finally caught up. Prosecutors did not present a case built on rage or sudden collapse. They presented something colder: planning, structure, a sequence of choices made not in panic, but in calm. Evidence showed that List had arranged finances, written notes, and staged the home to delay discovery. This was not an exit born of fear. It was an exit engineered to preserve control. The defense leaned on a familiar argument: pressure, financial stress, a rigid belief system that left no room for failure. They suggested that List believed he was acting out of duty, that he saw himself as preventing shame rather than causing harm. But the jury heard what followed that belief. They heard about the 18 years he spent free while others lived with unanswered loss, about the deliberate reinvention, about the fact that he did not come forward, did not confess, did not seek accountability. He simply replaced one life with another and waited. Witnesses described the contrast between the man in the photographs from 1971 and the man in the courtroom: older, grayer, but unmistakably the same. The mask had aged, but it had not cracked. Psychological experts testified about personality traits tied to extreme control and moral rigidity. They spoke about individuals who see the world in absolutes, success or failure, order or disgrace, and how, when that structure collapses, they do not bend, they erase. What stood out to jurors was not emotion, but absence of it. Throughout the proceedings, List remained composed, no outbursts, no visible remorse. When family members of the victim spoke, he listened quietly, hands folded, expression unchanged. The verdict did not take long. John List was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court rejected the idea that belief justified destruction or that discipline excused disappearance. The judge described the crime as one rooted in calculation, not confusion. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked the same question the public had asked for years: how could someone live an ordinary life after something like this? The answer was unsettling in its simplicity. because no one knew who he really was. The John List case became a landmark not just for its brutality, but for its lesson. It showed that some crimes are not hidden by chaos, but by patience. That disappearance can be as intentional as action, and that the most dangerous transformations are not loud. They are quiet, methodical, and socially acceptable on the surface. Years later, the story is still studied by investigators and psychologists alike, not because of how fast it unfolded, but because of how long it waited. Because for 18 years, a man proved that you do not have to run forever. You only have to blend in long enough. In the winter of 1982, Robert Durst reported his wife missing. It sounded ordinary at first. A strained marriage, an argument, a woman who simply did not come home. In New York City, people vanished all the time. And for a while, Kathleen Durst became just another name on a list that grew cold. Robert Durst told police they had argued. He said she left their apartment angry, possibly to stay with friends. There were no witnesses who saw her after that night. No confirmed sightings. No body. Without physical proof, investigators were left with fragments, inconsistent statements, an uneasy timeline, and a husband who seemed strangely detached from the search. Durst moved on quickly. He stopped cooperating. He avoided interviews. The disappearance lingered as a rumor rather than a case, defined more by absence than evidence. For years, it appeared that whatever happened inside that marriage would never be proven. Then the pattern widened. In the late 1990s, Durst was linked to the killing of Morris Black, a neighbor in Texas. This time, there was no disappearance to debate. Durst admitted involvement, but claimed self-defense. He was acquitted. To many watching, it looked like lightning striking twice suspicion without consequence. But investigators did not see isolated events. They saw continuity. A third death brought everything back into focus. In 2000, Susan Berman, a longtime friend who had knowledge of Kathleen Durst's disappearance, was found killed in her California home. Prosecutors believed she knew too much. They believed she had become a liability. This time, the case did not fade. Years later, during a documentary interview, Durst agreed to speak on camera. He appeared fragile, candid, almost relieved. But the microphones kept recording when he thought they were off. What followed was not a confession in the traditional sense, but something just as damaging: words that suggested awareness, regret, and proximity to the truth. Prosecutors used that moment to argue consciousness of guilt. Not panic, not accident, awareness. In 2021, Durst was convicted for the killing of Susan Berman. The courtroom heard about decades of evasions, coded behavior, and a man who survived not by innocence, but by staying just ahead of proof. The jury was shown how wealth, mobility, and silence can stretch a shadow across generations. Kathleen Durst's case remained unresolved. No charges were filed. No definitive answers surfaced. Yet her disappearance shaped everything that followed. It was the first fracture, the moment where control replaced partnership and silence replaced explanation. Robert Durst died in custody after the conviction. But the questions did not die with him. The story endures because it exposes a particular kind of danger. Not explosive, not impulsive, but patient, calculated. A life built around avoiding consequences rather than facing truth. In the end, Robert Durst was convicted for one killing. But he will always be remembered for another. The one that vanished into thin air and refused to stay buried. Because some shadows do not need evidence to exist. They only need time. When the verdict came down in 2021, the courtroom focused on one confirmed crime. But the story surrounding Robert Durst was never just about a single case. It was about time, how long suspicion can survive without resolution, and how power can stretch uncertainty across decades. Prosecutors framed the conviction not as an isolated moment, but as the collapse of a long-running strategy. For nearly 40 years, Durst had relied on the same tools: silence, distance, and the benefit of doubt created by missing evidence. He did not flee in panic. He waited. He adapted. He trusted that absence would do the work for him. The trial centered on patterns rather than passion. Jurors heard how Durst moved between states, identities, and narratives. How he avoided emotional displays when expected, yet inserted himself into situations that allowed control. How money insulated him from pressure, and how time blurred urgency. Most importantly, they heard how one disappearance sat quietly at the center of everything. Kathleen Durst was never found, but prosecutors argued her absence shaped the later killings not as coincidence, but as precedent. If a spouse could vanish without consequence, then silence became a proven method. Each later decision, they said, rested on the belief that the system could be outlasted. The defense argued fragility. They argued confusion, age, and poor health. They pointed to gaps in memory and the unreliability of old witnesses. But the jury was not asked to solve the 1982 disappearance. They were asked to decide whether a man who had escaped accountability once believed he could do it again. They answered yes. The conviction closed one chapter, but it did not resolve the central question. Kathleen Durst's case remained open in theory, closed in practice. Without physical proof, prosecutors could not move forward. The absence that once protected Robert Durst now protected his secret. After the trial, investigators spoke carefully. They acknowledged what could be proven and what could not. They admitted that some answers would likely never come. Durst himself offered none. He maintained control to the end, leaving behind silence rather than explanation. Public reaction was divided between relief and frustration. Relief that one case finally reached accountability. Frustration that the original disappearance, the moment that defined everything, remained legally untouched. To many observers, justice arrived late and incomplete. Yet the case changed how long-form investigations are viewed. It showed how circumstantial patterns, when sustained over time, can finally outweigh privilege. It demonstrated the value of persistence when certainty is unavailable, and it reminded the public that normal behavior can be the most effective disguise of all. Robert Durst did not fit the stereotype of rage or chaos. His danger came from restraint, from patience, from the belief that if he waited long enough, truth would lose its voice. He died in custody, convicted but not fully answered. The record shows one confirmed killing. The history suggests more. And between those two facts sits a disappearance that still defines his name. Because in the end, the most unsettling crimes are not always the ones that end loudly. They are the ones that never end at all.